everybody.
I'm pressing record. You can see that. Okay, here we go.
Hi, Nicholas. Great to see you.
G'day, Peyton.
So,
I'm
yeah, we
all
had a
stocked up. I've got a full pot of green tea. So it's appropriate I'm talking to someone. It's Japanese green tea. It's appropriate I'm talking to someone from Japan.
well, I guess I wouldn't say I'm from Japan, but
No, well
certainly
you are at the moment.
yeah. Um, but yeah, I really enjoyed our talk last week, and I thought this week it would be great to continue along the theme of paying attention. And you drew my attention to a blog article you published, I believe, last or earlier this week
Yeah, I think it was
about
yesterday and it was 7 tweets and I've now expanded it slightly, but not very. Twitter's very good for me in that sense. It compresses. It's really quite good.
yeah. I hear it's a good way to sort of build a writing workflow around writing Twitter tweets and then expanding that out to longer pieces too. Um, but yeah, so the topic of this article was, on one level, it was about whether or not, I mean, the fundamental question was whether or not or how important was proportional representation to New Zealand, or the role it would play in New Zealand's politics. And you wrote about how, in some ways, a question like that is missing the mark. Is that would that be a fair way to?
Yeah. So I had had a bit of a rant on Twitter, just to uh, made some political comments, and then someone had responded, and then I'd sent them a piece that I wrote about what's going wrong with our democracy. I won't go into that at the moment. We might go into it. And he wrote back after a couple of exchanges. He said, "Intriguing. I'll give these a read. What are your thoughts on shifting to a proportional lower house or a hybrid proportional similar to New Zealand?" So, for the benefit of people who don't know this, New Zealand and Australia have a similar political tradition, which won't surprise anyone from Britain. So, it's the Westminster system. They abolished their upper house many decades ago, as did Queensland, by the way, and they ended up with a very powerful lower house. If you can form the government in the lower house, you can do whatever you like. And this produced very radical economic reform, and that economic reform worked a lot less well than the economic reform next door in Australia, which was where there was quite a lot more political haggling going on with an upper house. And so what they did was they kept their lower house. They changed the way it was elected so that any party that was getting, I think, 5% or more of the vote, I don't know the exact details, got seats. And there are single member electorates, and then there is a top up list. And this produces something closer to proportional representation. And since then, their politics, most people think their politics has been better. And so that then creates that nice little debating point, which is proportional representation better than single member electorates under the Westminster system? And should we do it? And it's a perfectly legitimate question. The only problem is my answer is I don't know the answer. um, and and so but I think I do know the proceed in a different way. And so this is then lines up with the sort of way I was trying to explain how I do economics and how I think generally, which is to say, I like to use Jerry Seinfeld's line. I don't know whether I did last week, which is,
Yeah,
girls, do you want to know what we're thinking? He's talking about men. We're not thinking anything. We're just walking around, looking around. And so the idea is that you try to notice things and you try to look for patterns and you try to look for opportunities to address the things that are bugging you, or maybe they're not even bugging you, but you can see that at least in certain respects, this is something we could do that would give us a strong expectation of making things better. Now that's a completely that's a very different way to think about this stuff.
mm,
And having got interested in all this sort of stuff, essentially what's wrong with our democracy, I've read a lot of academic literature on politics, political theory, and I've found it nearly as disappointing as the academic literature in economics, because it is written by people who are being rewarded for developing their discipline, and their discipline is an abstracted thing, which will talk about questions like what's better about proportional representation versus single member electorates, etc., etc., etc. So it's not trying to work out what are the things that are wrong that we can really do something we can do a lot better. I'll just I've gone on a bit here, but I'll just say that I then often end up back in the land of political theory, but it's what I read in political theory I don't find very interesting, and I'm back in the land of political theory because I'm trying to theoretically reflect on what is in front of me. So let me just give you an example of what I mean by that. The ethics committees in universities and elsewhere are a kind of perfect example of a particular style of government that comes to us ultimately from representative democracy. I can explain that later. That is totally dysfunctional. You only have to see it working to see how unbelievably dysfunctional it is. It is. And we could cut right through that by saying, let's appoint a citizen jury for any particular thing we want to know whether it's ethical or not, and we'll ask them, are you okay with this? And with 99% of university research, which is delayed and made incredibly more expensive by this rubbish, which then turns out to be a big PR story and stops research that is important on the grounds that, in fact, the PR people get involved and they say it's not ethical because it makes us feel yucky. What if it ends up on the front page? That would all be finessed. It would be much more democratic, much simpler, much fairer. So that's that's a different way to go about things. Then you can go back and ask the question, well, if you think I'm telling you, if you think what I've said is right, why? What are the theoretical reflections we can have to explain those two things? And I find very little of that in the academic literature or anywhere else, basically.
In the blog, you use this term hacks versus, I mean, and I know you defined this in another article you wrote, but how would you describe that term, how would that compare to, say, something that's not a hack, something that's more, perhaps you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So a hack comes from, I think the term is used, I mean, you've heard of the expression life hacks. It sort of became a pretty popular expression, and I'm pretty sure it comes from coding. So it's one of those, and lots of words that have been come to us from coding are pretty cool. The coders they sort of live in this crystalline world, but they're dealing with life itself and they're codifying various things, and so it means they come up with some very nice words that capture things. And so a hack is something where you're trying to do something, and a hack is a sort of quick way, and it's often quite an elegant way to do something. It might be make a window open when someone clicks on it, and you will do it by, referencing, I'm not a coder, but you'll reference the operating system will just enable you to do that fairly easily. Or maybe you come up with a clever way to use the operating system when other hackers or other coders didn't realize that you could do it in that way. And the way I explain the way I explained this, and this came out of a debate which I had with Martin Wolf, who's a friend of mine and is many people will have heard of him. He's the chief economic writer for the Financial Times, and I used this word hack in a presentation that I gave that he was a discussant on, and I can send people to that if they're interested. And we had an email exchange about it, and I wrote an article about this to try and explain it to myself. And I was talking about economic reform, and I was talking about, so Milton Friedman, neoliberal saint if you're a neoliberal and a sinner if you're not. Milton Friedman comes up with this idea. He's suspicious. He's a very clever guy who unpacks his. He's very strategic, very tactical, and he unpacks ideas. So what he says is, all right, I don't think that the government should provide everyone's education. That's not part of a free society. It was better in the, he doesn't say it was better in the 19th century, but the point is he wants to get government out of supplying education. Well, he's never going to get anywhere with that idea. No one will vote for that. So then he says, well, there's a difference between the government paying for education for which there is a legitimate reason and delivering the service. And that leads directly to the idea of school vouchers and vouchers generally. So we won't tell you which school to go to. We won't tell you which hospital to go to. Pick any service you like. We'll give you a voucher and you will decide. Now, I'm not saying it's necessarily a great idea to have the idea and have it as part of your repertoire. It's not, I'm not saying it's good in any particular circumstance, but it's a good, and that is a hack. So the idea is Milton Friedman's idea, well, there's a difference between funding and provision, and it leads directly to a hack, which is, well, we can do that quite easily. Now, consider another colleague of Milton Friedman's, George Stigler, whose research purported to show that, and I think, not nearly as, anyway, he was one of the early people showing us that if you regulate an industry, the regulators end up seeing things through the eyes of the industry and sort of getting captured. And the problem with that is that he might be right, but the regulation is addressing genuine problems, monopoly pricing, bad service, and so on, because these things are private monopolies. And he doesn't have a hack. He doesn't have something to say, here, just, I had this idea and it led to this insight, and here's the managerial way to implement the idea. That's what you can do with vouchers. It's what you can do with tradable permits with another economist, Ronald Coase. I won't go into it, but that was an idea plus a hack. And then there are lots of ideas that don't come with hacks. And we shouldn't not think about those ideas, but they're much less promising because they just lead you into dilemmas, and you think you've thought your way into a whole lot of new territory, and isn't that good? But and it is kind of, it's a big pat on the back for you, but it doesn't lead to anyone getting a better life out of it. And sometimes that's, and often that's not true. So all of my thinking, I wouldn't be that interested in democracy, which is in a terrible state. I don't say it's in a terrible state, therefore here am I, I've got to fix it. The reason I'm so wound up about it is that I think there are simple hacks that we have that can do a lot of good. They're not going to they're not going to take us to utopia, but they can do a lot of good. Is that a reasonable description?
Yeah,
Is that a
I think
reasonable
so.
elaboration of the idea?
I think so, and I think it's an interesting idea. This having a hack, in the sense that, I suppose the main criticism of a hack is that it sort of addresses things in a piecemeal
It
manner, and
does.
it doesn't quite, it doesn't address the core of the problem.
It's
But
not as emotionally satisfying as a comprehensive solution, which is to abolish capitalism or defund the police or any of those things.
yeah, but at the same time, I think that, besides that, there are two major things going for it. One is you reduce the risk of unintended consequences. So, for example,
Yeah.
let's say you just got rid of the public school system and just moved all schooling to private. Well, besides that just being disruptive on a number of levels, you might find some really surprising outcomes in terms of, let's say, who's going to be providing school lunches, for example.
Absolutely. There are
children.
there are huge issues here. And the idea that because someone with a few ideas about funding has the solution is a terrifying one.
But I think the other nice thing about a hack is that you really have to understand the dynamics of the existing system and how they already work together. If you really
Well,
want to,
only in a particular area. So you're not claiming that you know everything. You're
right, right,
saying, hang on, this thing called ethics committees, which leads to all these bits of research that I can identify for you being having obstacles put in their way for absurd reasons and then stopped for other absurd reasons, and then people doing very good research which leads their university in a friend this happened to a friend of mine. He conducted an experiment which illustrated that bus drivers were unconsciously racist. He just got people to get on a bus and say, "Would you mind? I don't have any money at the moment. Can you take me to the next stop?" They 70% of them said yes for white people and 43% for darker people or whatever. The local bus company hit the roof, and this guy was wrongly accused within the university of not following ethics procedures. It was the absolute essence of unethical behaviour by the ethics committee, by the ethics bureaucracy. So I'm only saying that I can do this bit better, and that it's always, we're just going to assume, because the alternative is we just don't do anything, we're going to assume that if we can see something, we get a good chance to make it better, it's likely to radiate out some other good things far more than bad things.
but in one sense too, there's a kind of like in the sense that you have to understand how at least that interface or that by which literally that kind of um, if you want to change a part of the system, you have to understand how that aspect of the system will connect to the other existing parts of the system, and you have to understand in a sense that surface pretty well. I mean,
Well, yes, but remember, the world is very modular. So an ethics committee is an ethics committee. I don't have to. I have to. No, so when I talked about the ethics committee, I made a comment about the interface between the ethics committee and outside when I said that it actually gets used far more for PR purposes than for genuine
right,
ethical
right,
purposes. So that is an additional objection I have, and that's why it'll get better if you do what I say.
yeah,
But nothing I'm suggesting is dependent upon that. It just happens to be an additional benefit that bad institutions radiate out bad things, and healing them tends, sometimes there'll be an exception to this, but healing them tends to radiate out good external benefits. And that's all I would claim. Now, there might be some other areas, but what this kind of, for me, what this conjures up is this kind of cargo cult that's been going on for about 20 or 30 years now, where people talk about systems thinking and complexity. Now, obviously, I don't want to damn anyone for whose lips utter those words. There are lots of people who are doing some terrific things there. Dave Snowden is one of them. If anyone's interested in that, it sort of knows who that is. But I just see this constantly. People talk about, the current system is linear thinking, and we've got to be more systems thinkers. I don't know what that means. I'm being perfectly systems thinking about that ethics committee. I'm looking at it. I'm seeing roughly the dynamics going on inside, and I'm saying that it leads to trouble. And the idea that systems thinking is going to solve it is a sort of is tied up with this idea that we're really doing science and we're going to understand this holistically. I mean, please, uh, we can't even work out. It's hard enough working out how to make a good cup of tea. I've discovered.
yeah.
So this idea that we're going to understand things holistically, we're going to kid ourselves about that. That's sort of kumbaya stuff. We will not be able to do that. Well, no one's ever understood anything much holistically. Sometimes we get these huge scientific breakthroughs, and they come from paying attention and working out from the phenomena.
Yeah. So But that's itself kind of interesting because if you have that, at least in terms of this idea of hacks. So what I'm kind of interested in is maybe you made this comment, which I also found sort of intriguing, which was that everything is modular or something along these lines.
Mm.
But
If it works, it's very likely to be pretty modular.
yeah, so
Yeah,
if you have, uh, well, there's a sense in which hacking something, it may not, let's say, illuminate the entire system, but it might, let's say, illuminate the surface at which it's sort of attaching to
absolutely.
the system,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
and making that maybe more not transparent, maybe is overused or not even really that applicable in this situation, but it makes it at least obvious or easy
Yeah,
to
more
easy,
evident, more evident, more
evident.
more
Yeah,
more apparent, more present. Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
Another way to think about this would be to say that we're in love with it. I mean, it's a very powerful thing to say you're only treating the symptoms, not the cause.
mm,
But in the humanities, in the social sciences, we don't know what's symptom and what's cause.
yeah,
And we know that they're sort of, we know that there are lots of different people with very different ideas about causes, um, across the political spectrum. So we can't even get agreement on that. But we can go for insightful observation of symptoms with a view to looking for opportunities to alleviate them, looking for opportunities to make them better, and and then we can test certain things. And once you're doing that, that's deep. That's giving you powerful causal information. Um, but jumping to a statement we've got to address the causes, not the symptoms, is embracing a kind of an impatience and a grandiosity. And it's just you're ending up going to have to pick one side of the ideological spectrum and cash in your chips. And it's an ugly story. It's an ugly story. So you'll have to stay very well possessed of the idea that you're good and people who disagree with you are knaves and fools.
yeah. And certainly the symptoms become their own causes in their own sense. Or, I mean, if you have a dysfunctional aspect of an organization that may be caused by something deeper, or maybe it's not, and
Yeah,
people are going
yeah,
to avoid using it, and they're going to try to find these workarounds, and then those have their own, drawbacks and inefficiencies. So those symptoms themselves are their own kind of disease. It's different than a human illness in that sense, I would
yeah,
imagine.
yeah.
So, I mean, so how does this, you talk a lot about paying attention, and I can kind of see how this relates to the idea of, you know, addressing what is obvious, what we can see, what we actually find, or what we observe, using, the full power of our intellect or our knowledge or academic training. But how can this idea of, I mean, there's a sense in which you touched on how a hack can be let's say a vehicle for cooperation in the sense that if I go to the U.S. government and I say I want to get rid of public education, and half, at least half the country, probably more, would just say, well, wait a minute, that's not what we want
Yeah,
to do, right? And so there's a
yeah,
sense in which, well, I can kind of get around that conflict,
yeah,
in a way, by avoiding it this way. But there's also a sense in which, let's say, exposing this like these systems or these interfaces between these different parts of the system can raise awareness around them, and maybe can lead to a more consensus in terms of addressing how to deal with them. Or do you think a hack can encourage cooperation in that sense?
I'm not sure. I mean, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, I do respect the Finns who say we're not going to have private schools. Um, I don't want to impose that on other
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
countries,
Sure,
or
sure.
I might want to, but I know I can't. So it's entirely academic. But there's so that it's not that you would totally ignore, the holistic perspective or whatever you want to say. Um, uh, again, that's sort of part of my philosophy of whatever wisdom you get, make it Socratic. Be aware of what you don't know. So, but in the world where that's not even an option, um, then this way to, what's happening with the development of that hack, Milton Friedman's hack for vouchers, is that it's unpacking an argument and it's then creating opportunities to get new coalitions, if you want to look at it politically, or it's creating new opportunities for more social cooperation and self-organization, if you want to look at it in that kind of way. Um, and generally, I wrote a column uh, which I could have, if I'd have thought about it, I could have. I'm now making the connection. It was a uh, I rather like. I suggested a title for this column I wrote, and I don't think the subby I don't think the sub editor accepted it, but it was High Ground and Hot Air at Glen Eagles, and it was about the Glen Eagles. There was a climate change conference in Glen Eagles, and this was 10 or so years ago. And what I argued was that the right and the left each had something to contribute, and that it would all, and that if, and that their collision would, they would each make the other better. And the argument went like, so the argument went like this: that the left feel that the rich countries have done all the damage, so we shouldn't ask anything of the poor countries. The right don't. The right are onto that as a completely absurd idea, because if the poor countries are getting richer, their emissions are growing, and if we just say to them, look, don't you worry about this for another 50 years, we're just stuffed. Um, and so um, so there had so and so I asked, if we have a drought, we don't say we ration water. This is more current in Australia, this sort of thing. We ration water, and we don't say if you're a poor house, if you're a poor household, just don't worry about the water rationing. So we all have to worry about the water rationing, and then and then the, so that was where the right would lead the left to drop its nonsense. And then the left has a chance to get the right, or ought to be pushing for the right to drop its nonsense, because it's pretty obvious that the solution to this is one of the few areas where economists can see a solution which is fair and efficient. There will be other things you need to do, but that is per capita emissions entitlements. There's no reason why someone born in Tibet shouldn't have the right to emit as much carbon as you or me. And so over time, we should lower emissions, and what emissions uh, are allowed should be parceled out on a per capita basis, which would produce a large redistribution of wealth to poorer people. So that's an example of how two perspectives fighting each other can, if you do it with a bit of intelligence, a bit of integrative desire, you can end up with a much better answer than either of them had. And so, again, maybe that's a somewhat different question, but it's again that, well, I did say much earlier, a long time ago in this conversation, that tradable permits are a hack, and that's where it leads. So you start with it. See, now look, it's actually a beautiful demonstration of what I'm saying. You start with this thing that works in some sense, and then you work back and you find that it's actually solved a bunch of pretty theoretical problems.
Hmm.
So it creates a legibility between the ideas and what the hell it is you do about them. There's a nice definition of a hack. Something that creates an actionable legibility between an idea, an issue, and what the hell it is you can do about it.
And that actionable legibility is, in some sense, well, I mean, would you say that this is, in some sense, a kind of public, if you were to call this a public good versus a private good, or something along these lines? this, you know, it doesn't belong in some sense to I mean, would you say that it doesn't belong to one person, but the hack, since it's a compromise, it has a more of a public
Yeah. So
characteristic?
so
Or
so it's a public good. It's a public good because it's an idea, and it's an idea of immense possibility. Could be applied in lots of different places. But I think the deeper, I mean, the thing that I want to say, following on from this, and again, this has just sort of occurred to me now. It's a way to express this. Imagine if the body of economics that we find in the literature and in textbooks, and the body of political theory was oriented around this idea that the really happy hunting ground is where ideas map onto hacks, where hacks generate this legibility and actionability. And then there's all the other stuff, and that's all pretty interesting. And you just go for your life. And if you have a theorist, and we've got a lot of money going into all of this, we've got tens of thousands of professors in all of these areas, and some of them will want to work on that, and I don't want to stop them working on that, but it's not very promising. In an area like competition policy, we'll cycle between being more and less aggressive with large companies, and it's a dilemma. It's just a dilemma, and I don't think there are any great breakthroughs there, but there are great things we can do where we can discover this pathway for human thought from an idea relatively cleanly into doing something that most of us can agree is a promising thing to do.
hmm. So, what kind of environment do you think is best for for creating this
Haha.
way of thinking? So, I know you're interested in sort of jury selection and choosing, um, uh, let's say, governing bodies by lot or by sortition. Um, you know, that would seem to create an environment that's a bit more open to compromise, to finding solutions that maybe apply to a specific scenario. But do you think in a larger democratic, kind of classic democratic conflict between two parties or multiple parties, do you think that uh, politicians can use these as evidence that they're doing their job? So for example, in at least in my observation in the United States, it seems like the office of the presidency has become one where it's important to court controversy, to make to really
Get
focus
into
on
the
the things that are the
papers.
most controversial, and
Yeah.
things that shouldn't probably be very controversial. They sort of have to make them more controversial than they are.
Well, I think their opponents usually try and do that.
Yeah.
Um, so, that we've seen this with the virus, we've seen this with vaccinations, things that were completely standard. Um, and I mean, I actually speak with some more sympathy than some people for people who are freaked out by how new these vaccines are and vaccine mandates. I'm still in favour of quite a few vaccine mandates, but I don't want to speak I don't want to speak contemptuously of those people who are freaked out by it. But certainly in my country, there are a very, very small minority, and yet, and until 5 years ago, it was just entirely normal to say, certainly in Australia, you said no jab, no family allowance. So you got a young child, you bring them we pay for their education, we pay for their vaccination, and if they're at school, they're a risk if they're not vaccinated
Yeah.
against mumps and yellow fever and measles and all kinds of stuff. And it was just regarded as pretty reasonable, pretty normal. You didn't force people to do it, but you got them to bear some of the costs firstly they could get medical exemptions of various kinds, and you got them to bear some of the costs that they impose upon others. all of a sudden this is a sort of outrageous proposition.
Yeah.
So that's how our politics works now. Because politics is a branch of the entertainment industry, sadly. It certainly propagates itself through the entertainment industry. It's much more entertaining for people to get on their high horse, dress up as Vikings, and behave like complete lunatics.
Yeah.
That's very entertaining. I was entertained. It's horrifying that anyway. So that's what we can see. So I don't know whether, I mean, Donald Trump ran his presidency in this very unusual way, which everybody thought would crash and burn, and turned out not to really. I mean, he lost, but I would have predicted he would end up, he would end up with 20% of the vote the way he behaved. Well, that was completely wrong. I don't think Biden is going out of his way to court. I mean, anti-Biden people will freak out at this point,
Sure.
but Sleepy Joe, does seem pretty sleepy, and yes, he wants to hop into Donald Trump as the gangster style politician he was. That is entirely reasonable as far as I can see. But he's not going there trying to crank up the how controversial he is. Certainly, Australian politics until recently rewarded politicians on both the right and the left for going for the centre, going for the median voter. It kind of makes sense. That's where the swing is going to happen, you would imagine.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing this raises is this idea that I've been banging on about paying attention and kind of going from there, raises this passage that I sent you from this guy called James Burnham, who wrote this remarkable book, I think, in 1943. He's a conservative, and the book is called The Machiavellians. And the argument, put into my language, not so much his, is that until Machiavelli came along, which is the 15th and but between the 15th and 16th century, until he came along, politics was political theory and political discussion was anchored in wishes, anchors in wishes, anchored in wishes. It was a statement of what should be the case. And it's highly unclear why we should care what should be the case. We care about what is the case and what we could make the case. And so Burnham argues, and in fact, I might try and find it and read it, because Burnham argues that, so he quotes Dante, as you will recall, and he itemizes. So this is something that Dante has written about. So where are we here? De Monarchia. So he writes about Dante's political treatise, which was called De Monarchia. Actually, the way to find this would be to look at the email that I sent you. Whoops. And what he's I marked it up, trying to do it too quickly. Impatience, you see. Let's see, there we are. Is that going to work? Yeah. So what he's saying is that, in fact, he explains why Dante's real agenda, who he wants to be in power, has got virtually nothing to do with all these fine words he's talking about God, the holiness of the king being passed down by God to St. Peter and various other things. And the thing that the striking point that he makes, I think, is he says, and yet all this. It's easy to dismiss Dante as having a solely historical, archaic, or biological interest. Few now would consider it seriously as a political tract. We seldom talk about eternal salvation in politics. all this is so, and yet it would be a great error to suppose that Dante's method in De Monarchia is outworn. His method is exactly that of the democratic platform with which we began our inquiry. So he starts with promises that Roosevelt made in 1932, these sacred promises to the people. I don't think he made them cynically. He said he was going to balance the budget, all other kinds of that he's now famous for not doing. And and so he goes on. This method is exactly what is, and but what Burnham is arguing is that political discourse is a kind of a wildly anchored in human wishes, and and highly rhetorical, and it leaves everyone happy. They go home happy, and they nothing's been said. What's been said is we want freedom from want, everyone to get on better with each other. We hate those rich people. We're going to screw them over. Well, at least if you say something specific, we'll raise taxes on the rich. Well, that's a specific thing, but most of it is not. And then he says, this method, it has been and continues to be the method of 9/10, yes, much more than 9/10 of all writing and speaking in the field of politics. And I think that is my way of putting that is that's theory first, not observation, not looking around for what are the things that we can be confident we can make better. When I say we can make better, that's the point of this. We're in politics now, not engineering, and we have to make it better. We have to. That's the point. If we so we kind of try and shuffle out of the ideology, and we try to see if we can build a community consent, or a large number of people in the community who want to make this thing better in this particular way that makes sense to them. And I think we could do lots of things.
Yeah, that's I think that's really interesting
So,
too.
so yeah, so politics, the way we have it, not just political rhetoric, not just political theory, but political practice is way too theoretical and almost has an aversion for saying, look, let's cut the malarkey. Let's just other big things we can do that could make things a lot better. And that's why I think citizen jury, that's one of the reasons, one of the many reasons. And one of the things I've suggested to you is we might, if we keep doing these things, we might do several on ways of looking at juries, citizen juries, randomly selected citizen juries, ways in which they're different. And this is one way in which they're different. People aren't fighting other people in those juries very much. They're all trying to say, what can we agree on that will address these things that are driving us crazy?
Yeah, yeah, and also to I'm thinking a little bit about how we talk about this as being kind of, I suppose, a modern idea of, or not modern, at least modern in the sense that Machiavelli first started talking about this, but in the sense that Machiavelli was, of course, a great reader of Livy, and I think that a lot of, let's say, the Roman politicians had this very realistic, let's say, perspective on what it meant to be in power and what it meant to exercise power, and actually what it meant to also the responsibilities of that. So and what
and it was it. So Machiavelli is very empirical in that he's reading as the as the founding fathers were, in a sense. I mean, they were they were off on Locke and these people, and so they were into high theory. They were trying to theorize, but at least their subject matter was the same as Machiavelli's, which is Livy and the ancient world and what has worked and what hasn't worked and why, and discussion of all that sort of stuff. Anyway, sorry, I may have cut across you.
Yeah, though it's interesting in the sense that so one of the things that I know that's important to you is finding people to fill political office who aren't necessarily seeking political office, because
Yeah,
those are the
yeah,
kinds of
yeah,
people who are most likely to get corrupted in a sense. But
yeah,
my I'm also kind of interested in the responsibilities of political office. And if you take someone, and this is my reading of Julius Caesar, which might not be 100% consensus, but when his rival Pompey was killed, and he expressed a lot of sorrow about this, being related to him by marriage and things like this. And it's sort of sometimes read as being disingenuous, but I believe
yeah,
actually very strongly that Julius Caesar wanted to have Pompey around. He wanted Pompey to go back to Rome and run the city properly, and run and govern, while he could go off and get the glory of being, the leader of this country. And he was aware in some senses that he wasn't up to the task, and that his, chief lieutenant Mark Antony was also very terrible at this kind of thing,
right.
though Mark Antony was a great soldier.
Yeah,
And it was Augustus Caesar who realized that the only way to end this conflict that keeps, destroying civil life in Rome, was to marry the office of the guy who sat there and actually governed the city with the person who went out into the provinces and carried out military conquest, and had to keep control over those two spheres of life. And even you read about Tiberius, the second emperor, and he had a lot of really awful vices that he's sort of famous for. But if you read about his life, he actually spent a lot of time just sitting in Rome listening to court cases, and he took that responsibility very seriously. But obviously that kind of aspect wasn't really sustainable, and it deteriorated depending on the quality of the emperor in charge and things like this. And so I guess the question this leads me back to, in a way, and is if one reason I think juries to some degree, or randomly selected groups of people, are effective, is that there's a sense in which they want to get the job done so they can they can go home, right? Like,
yeah,
especially a jury
yeah,
deliberating over a trial, they don't want to spend their life in this kind of seclusion from the public, and they want to be with their
yeah,
families,
yeah.
go back to
That's
their
right. They've
jobs.
got a job to do. They've got a solution to find.
And it really puts the pressure of responsibility to actually find that solution on a
Yeah,
person,
yeah,
in a way that I think public office in a democracy is supposed to do, but it it doesn't necessarily work, because in some ways the office itself carries so much power with it, and the people who are, let's say, funding these political elections, or this sort of funding the people who are in office, are also exercising a lot of power without the restraints of being in power or holding office. So I guess the question is and we got a little bit off the track of the main point of the conversation, about how these kinds of hacks that really address the contingencies of a situation, rather than, let's say, the grand theory of it. Um, is there are there other mechanisms or other tools at our disposal to make sure that people in office, or that people who are exercising political power or working with politics, are able to, let's say, stay focused on what they actually have to do?
yeah. It's a very interesting question, because if you look at, again, if you pay attention, if you look at the fabric of the life of a politician, I was actually saying this to someone earlier today who works for a politician. It's we've got a prime minister right now who's really just terribly bad. He's got a lot of confidence, and what is shocking is that, I mean, the public can see how how incompetently the government has behaved, and often when that happens, it's actually not the politicians' fault; it's bureaucrats' fault. Well, governments are asked to do lots of difficult things, and the bureaucracy are not very good at doing them. But in this case, this guy has just made one disastrous mistake after another, and you know, through no fault of his own, it's evident to people. You don't have to look up freedom of information. You don't have to use freedom of information, which is more or less ground to a halt here, to work this out. And this was also true of Donald Trump to some extent. He would say, you know, the virus is a hoax, and then it turns out it's not, and so on. Now, our guy, Scott Morrison, is not nearly as incompetent as that. But what is very, I think, very sad is that I expect he will be voted out at the next election. His replacement is not terribly inspiring. If he was, then he would be more likely to be voted out at the next election. But even with just this endless string of obvious incompetence and a heedlessness about doing the right thing, you know, it's a touch and go thing, you know, like Donald Trump. And so the incentives upon career politicians are so far from doing the best they can from the people that it's you know, they do that out of the goodness of their heart. Unfortunately, I mean, I know quite a lot of politicians, and on both sides of the aisle they're mostly pretty decent people, and they go into politics because they have, you know, they're sort of egotists, and they like to spout off and pontificate like I do. but but they kind of want to do the right thing, and then they're in this environment where there's massive pressure on them to do the wrong thing in small ways. You know, they've got to get money from some business or some interest, and that means they can't do these things that they ought to do. And that's their life. Their life is acting pure as the driven snow in public while they do all kinds of mildly dirty and sometimes very dirty things. Now that's a very now that's what we call accountability, accountability through elections and so on. And I'm not suggesting we get rid of this very crude kind of accountability. The people should be able to get rid of people that they think are beyond the pale and they don't support. But let's not get carried away that we've got accountability either in politics or at the next layer down in bureaucracy, or in banking for that matter. It's just not there. So this is a response to your question now asked some time ago. If you don't tell people you're going to check up on them and hold them accountable, they mostly do their best. So if you interview people who've come out of a legal jury or a citizens jury, which is these things that are increasingly held in politics, people really try. And onlookers who are skeptical observe this and they go, gee, that's pretty impressive. Not everyone. There's some lazy slobs who you wouldn't be able to, you just wouldn't, in the words of John Cleese in the Parrot sketch, they wouldn't vroom if you put 2,000 volts through them. But most people do their best and are very energized by this process. So paradoxically, accountability to each other, accountability to normal human culture, I think, is a more powerful way to motivate us towards the good than an accountability regime, which we are now observing in its full toxicity. That would be my way of putting it.
Well, that's a good way of putting it. It raises some interesting questions too. But I think yeah, this might be a good stopping
All
point,
right,
and we
that
can
sounds good.
continue the conversation next week if there's yeah. So, um, but thank you very much, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks, Peyton. Now I've just, there we are.